We are on part 42 of our Wild Harvest Edible series, Thou Preparest a Table Before Me. And just a reminder as we go into this that it's important that as you navigate any health challenge, it's always recommended that you partner with a medical practitioner that shares your philosophy of the care of the human body in disease and in health. And the information that's provided here is educational in nature and has been used by others to improve their wellness, and returning and maintaining health shouldn't be construed as medical advice, just as tools that have been successfully used. There may be treatments suggested or protocols, but just investigate them thoroughly for yourself. Don't accept anything without doing due diligence prior to engaging in it. Thomas Edison said many years ago that the doctor of the future will give no medicine, but will instruct his patient in the care of the human frame, in diet, and in the cause and prevention of disease. He's a well-known person that I believe had faith, but was also well-known in worldly circles as well, just from his inventions. But the most widely quoted and written woman author in the world had some things to say on this too. Testimonies for the Church, 1885. Ellen White said that there are many ways of practicing the healing art, but there is only one way that heaven approves. God's remedies are the simple agencies of nature that will not tax or debilitate the system through their powerful properties. Pure air and water, cleanliness, a proper diet, purity of life, and the firm trust in God are remedies for the want of which thousands are dying. Yet these remedies are going out of date because their skillful use requires work that the people do not appreciate. Fresh air, exercise, pure water, and clean, sweet premises are within the reach of all, with but little expense. But drugs are expensive, both in the outlay of means and the effect produced upon the system. In 3 John 1, verse 2, we're reminded that Christ said, "Beloved, I pray that you may prosper in all things and be in health." Actually, I think this was John who was stating this, just as your soul prospers. And then Romans 12, 1 and 2, it says, "I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your body as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God." So just some things to keep in mind as you go through your day and are sharing with others possible benefits that they could experience from the things that God has provided for us. Today we're going to be looking at Elecampane, also known as Inula Helenum. And it's interesting that name, most scientific names have some story behind them. And one of the genus name Inulin or inulae is because this particular plant has inulin in it. So inulin is a polysaccharide or a many-chain carbohydrate that has some sweet effects to it, but doesn't affect blood sugar. In fact, it helps to balance blood sugar. So there are other things that have inulin in them as well. This is just one, particularly in the root. And then its species name, Helenum, is from the story of Helen of Troy. It's said to grow where Helen of Troy's tears fell. So this is a legend. I don't know that it's necessarily, it may have been a true story. Certainly the Trojan War was a true war. But she was out collecting Elecampane when she was captured. And when she was crying on her way with her captors and where her tears dropped, that's where Elecampane flower sprouted up along the trail. And that was the initiation of the Trojan War, which is kind of interesting. So it has some remembrance within the Celtic culture. It's also known as horseheel, horse elder, wild sunflower, elf dock, and starwort. So that's why it's important to know scientific names, because there are many different common names that a particular plant can go by in a particular area or region. And coming from one region to another, you may call it something different just by its common vernacular. It is in the Asteraceae family, which some people happen to be allergic to the daisy family, the aster family. And so should be cautious and or avoid it if that happens to be the case. Its habitat is typically in moist, shady places. It's cultivated in Europe, but also in the United States. It's been naturalized, particularly in the East, but it can grow all the way across the nation, often in roadsides, pastures, and it likes the bases of east and southern facing slopes, probably because of its access to sunlight. It looks like it could have a similar background to like Arnica, has a similar flower. Arnica is also in the Asteraceae family. So it's upright, can grow to 6 feet tall, so it can be quite tall. I think we just did one that was quite tall the other day, looking at lovage. That's a high, tall growing plant too, but this can get to 6 feet. Large, rough leaves with toothed edges. Can be a variety of different shapes, can be egg-shaped to lance-shaped to elliptical-shaped. So a variety of different presentations. And the edges are toothed. They can be 12 to 20 inches long, so quite big, and then 5 inches wide. The upper side is very green and has a hair on it, hairy, and the underside is whitish and velvety. That hair on the surface of the leaves basically cuts down on the airflow over the leaves. The hairier the leaf, the less moisture is going to be lost and the less airflow there's going to be over those leaves. So it helps to have thermal retentive properties as well as moisture retention capacity. And also they can function as irritants to herbivores. Human herbivores have the benefit of cooking. Other herbivores that don't have the benefit of cooking may be irritated by those hairs on whatever plant it might be in a way that cooking would deactivate just from its physical properties as well. Sometimes, in the case of nettles, for example, the irritant that's present as well. So the flowers can be up to 3 inches with 50 to 100 ray flowers. So a ray flower is those spindly petals that are going around the outside of the flower. And 100 to 250 disc flowers. They're tiny little flowers that make up the central portion. So this is a composite flower. All Asteraceae family flowers are composite flowers. With ray flowers, that's the ones that have the petals that go out around the outside, and then the disc flowers are the central flowers. And the ray flowers and the disc flowers have both pistils and stamens and anthers, so they can pollinate and produce seeds. And this would also produce, because it's in the Asteraceae family, a kind of a downy seed, like a dandelion is in the Asteraceae family, a typical kind of a ray flower, although it doesn't have a central disc like we see here. The roots are large and thick. They're mucilaginous in nature if they're powdered and have water added to them. And they're quite bitter. So this would be like dandelion is a bitter. This is a bitter, and bitter has a place in the palate that most North Americans have not fully developed, and that bitter is actually very beneficial. So it's not something you should steer away from, but actually should try to cultivate more in our palate. The root also has a very floral kind of a scent to it. So from an edibility standpoint, the root is really the focused part from an edibility standpoint. Can be used as a condiment. Again, it has that inulin content that you could shave it or slice it. You could even cook it. It actually has a pre-biotic component in it that supports healthy gut flora. So it helps to maintain and provide the fiber, and the inulin itself is actually a polysaccharide that beneficial gut flora thrive on. Sometimes people don't get enough of that prebiotic and biotic flora and fiber in their gut. So that can be helpful for that. It's just a bitter plant. The roots are the primary part that is consumed in Elecampane, and we'll look at some additional components of it from a medicinal standpoint here momentarily. So medicinal roles, the roots and the flowers are used, although the root have the most potent properties. And of course, the root is going to be present year-round, can be gathered, typically has a seasonal gathering time, but it's going to be available all through the year, whereas the flowers are just used as fresh, or they need to be collected while it's fresh. You can see the serrated edges on this particular picture of the flower. Looking at the leaf there on the upper right, you can see the they're not deeply indented, but very tightly serrated edges. So the roots can be used fresh or dry. You can use a honey infusion So that'd be a little bit like an oil extraction, in that you would put grated root and honey together, and it would draw the therapeutic properties from the root. We've done this with onion. So if you take onion and dice it and layer it alternating with honey, it sucks out the moisture and the therapeutic properties from the onion. Then you strain off that syrup, and it makes a great cough syrup. So in a similar fashion, you can do that here with the root of Elecampane. You could do an alcohol or vegetable glycerin extraction and also make a cough syrup from that. If you were going to use it internally, I'd recommend the vegetable glycerin route, in that you're not going to be indulging or ingesting alcohol. You can also make a tea from the root, an inulin tea, that has those kind of bitter flavors to them that one could benefit from cultivating. When you're using anything, and particularly with Elecampane, you want to begin use slowly, so the effects aren't strong. If you take a lot right away, it might be, you wouldn't want to be taking a lot of something that you're allergic to. Also, you're not knowing the effects of it, because this does have some blood sugar effects. That's something you'll want to monitor as you use it. If you're using it for any quantity for any length of time, now and then probably is not going to be an issue, but using it for a therapeutic modality that's used on a repeated basis, you don't want to monitor that closely. You don't want to take enough that it's going to make you nauseous. If you're nauseous, you've taken too much. And it can have some drying effects, particularly in the role of mucus production. And you don't want to be over dry. So those are some beneficial properties, but using it in the proper way. They contain two different bioactive compounds that have been studied. There may be more than that, but allantoglactone, it should be lactone, and isolantolactone are two qualities, sesquiterpene lactones that are found in Elecampane, which are therapeutic. They have antibacterial, antifungal, vermifuge, which is deworming activities, anti-cancer, and apoptosis promoting, which is essentially the cells inbred or inborn lifespan. So all cells have a lifespan at which they should terminate. Our skin cells are some of the most rapidly regenerating cells. Our bones are some of the slowest, about 10 years to get a whole new set of cells in the bone. So if you're 70 years old, you've had 7 times of bone renewal over the course of your lifespan. It's particularly helpful in issues of the lungs. So the root is an excellent expectorant. So an expectorant is something that helps to break up the mucus and allow it to be expelled by the body more easily. One of the things that is very challenging is what's called a non-productive cough, just a cough with like rough mucus that you just cough and it's just rattling there and you just can't get it to release and come out. This helps to break it out. So it also functions in a cough suppressant way, not only in a suppressive way, but in a function of breaking up the mucus and allowing it to be productive and get rid of what's there. So it's helpful in asthma type of coughs, bronchitis, whooping cough, and coughs that are caused by tuberculosis. So it's respiratory beneficial for all respiratory type of illnesses, especially those with excess mucus production. Just helps to get that cleared out. So a rattly chest is something that you don't want to keep around, so it helps to alleviate that. Also soothes the lining of the bronchial tubes. So there's endothelium, epithelial cells that line those. They can be irritated by various things. Airborne irritants can help to reduce the swelling and airway irritation. And also if there are bacterial infections or things like that, it can help cleanse the lungs of those colonizing organisms. So it's a lung purifier, essentially. So it's very helpful for acute coughs. So acute means that it's comes on quickly, just a cough that shows up as opposed to a chronic cough like someone who has bronchitis or emphysema or something else that is just a constant irritant. So chronic coughs definitely need to have their own kind of addressing, but acute coughs can be alleviated or minimized using Elecampane. So using small doses, using them often is very helpful, especially with people who are suffering from various types of asthma. So you can get it in a capsule form, you can get it in a powder form, you can get it in a tincture form. You can see that picture on the bottom there, and then just kind of a rough, loose, ground, sliced, diced form that you could use in a tea. Put that in a tea ball or a bag and use it as a tea. So it can also function as an appetite stimulant and a digestive stimulant. Kind of has warming, draining, and bitter properties. So you can see your GI system on the right here, the small intestines, kind of centrally located with your ascending, transverse, and descending colon around the outside. You can see the finger of the appendix down on the lower left in the picture, lower right on your own body. But it aids poor digestion, helps to increase absorption. If a person has poor appetite, it can stimulate the appetite and helps to mitigate if there's excess gastrointestinal mucus that's being produced. And a lot of times that gastrointestinal, that GI mucus is produced by the things we eat. So if we alter our diet, for example, dairy is very mucus producing. So turning away from those types of things, so dairy and cheeses, yogurts and that type of thing. Many people think that they need to have yogurt because of the probiotic effects, but there are many sources of providing probiotic flourishing material in your gut rather than having to rely upon a dairy product for that. So sometimes people have a sluggish GI, just slows down, and a slow GI can be due to reduced fiber. So the ultimate way to do that would be to increase your fiber intake through eating lots of greens, but this would be a way if someone was intestinally bound up, not a laxative effect, but just increasing intestinal motility to help keep it moving through. So it helps to strengthen the digestion and the absorption. So people who are undernourished or malnourished can benefit by including this in their diet just by allowing them to access nutrients more completely. It also has some anti-inflammatory components that are associated with diabetes and beneficial for that. So the acronym SAD stands for Standard American Diet, and many people manifest symptoms, their weight, for example, and other things because they're overfed and undernourished. Essentially, they're eating calorically dense food that's nutritionally empty and or toxic. So it has maybe glyphosate on it or other chemicals that have been sprayed in the agricultural processes or in the cleansing process, perhaps, and or the anti-nutritive components of the lectins that are found in on seeds that keep them from sprouting. Those are anti-nutrients if they're taken into your body without having had them soaked off and rinsed away. So they can actually be anti-productive. But using Elecampane can help overcome some of these things and aid a person who's still in the SAD diet, but also those who are turning away from that and need to have additional nourishment and mineral and nutrient retention and extraction from the food that they are getting. So if someone's on a reduced caloric diet just due to food scarcity, perhaps, this could be helpful in extracting the most amount of nutritive value from the food that you do have available. Type 2 diabetics can benefit. We talked about inulin. So inulin is a polysaccharide, which is just a multiple chain sugar that has benefits for blood sugar stabilization. So interesting that it's very close to insulin. Insulin is the protein that's produced by your body, by the pancreas, that helps to modulate and actually is a signal for your cells to take up sugar. But if your cells are already jam-packed with sugar and or you're consuming that sugar along with free fats, those free fats are like grease in the doorknob on the cell, and the insulin comes up and it can't even open the door. So it's interesting to see, looking at a blood draw in someone who has just consumed a meal that has a a component of free fats in it. It can be a lot of free fat or a little free fat, but you can still see that free fat show up in a blood column as a fat layer from freshly drawn blood. Most pronounced, I've seen this and demonstrated in people who have eaten fast food diets, like a Big Mac and fries, for example. But there's a whole spectrum. So it helps to reduce blood sugar spikes. So it would help someone's A1C. So an A1C is a marker of blood sugar spikes throughout a period of time, and is kind of an average. Looking at the blood cell representations on the surface of the blood cell, but this can help to even out the blood sugar spikes in a person's diet. But need to pay attention to that. It can also reduce diabetic inflammation, but it can also decrease blood sugar significantly to the point where it could be dangerous. So that needs to be monitored specifically, especially if you're using it on a regular basis or in any kind of quantity. It's also helpful as a vermifuge, as an intestinal parasite reducer, and eliminates some intestinal parasites, hookworm, roundworm, threadworm, and whipworm in particular. So you can see a picture of a hookworm up here. It's more prevalent in southern states. This is a hookworm on the intestinal mucosa on the inside of an intestinal wall. They often will come in from bare feet in the southern environment, walking through the soil, and enters the circulatory system that way, and then winds up in the digestive tract. Can also come from food sources as well. But that's a parasite that Elecampane can help to eliminate from the GI tract. Roundworms, Ascaris is a classic roundworm. Some places people have very high loads of Ascaris, and they can be debilitating when their parasite load becomes high. In fact, there are many illnesses that probably have a fairly significant parasite load aspect that isn't really tested for. That may be one reason why we see things like ivermectin, that is a vermifuge in its own right, having some positive effects in our current environment. Threadworms, you can see how small those threadworms are. And then whipworms, you can see why it's called a whipworm. Has a large body with a very thin tail that looks like a bullwhip, in fact. So some symptoms that people might experience if they have a parasite load: an itchy groin and anus, especially during sleep, even a sleep disturbing itch that wakes you up. That could be an indicator that you have some kind of worms, parasitic intestinal worms. If you have a high load, it can end up resulting in appetite loss, weight loss, because the worms are getting the most nutrition. Insomnia, keeps you awake at night. Irritability, which, insomnia and irritability kind of go together, don't they? If you're treating an individual for worms, the whole family ought to have the same treatment, including the pets probably. I wouldn't necessarily recommend this for pet deworming, but we have a family friend who has horses, and every spring when the garlic comes out, they haven't wormed their horses for years because they have noticed the positive benefits of the horses going and grazing on the garlic and the vermifuge effects of the garlic. They just see it in the stool and they can smell it on the breath. But it works very effectively for their small herd of horses. So keeping your parasite load down to nothing is optimal, but that is one role that Elecampane can play. So it can also have some cancer therapeutics. So two compounds that help in that. We mentioned that earlier: sesquiterpene lactones, essentially specifically allantoglactone. It has been described as having anti-tumor activity in lung cancer cell lines, and there's several different cell lines that they did that study on. Liu et al. Did this back in September 2019, and this was published in the Journal of Food Chemistry. Not this particular article, but there were several articles as well on the same compound found in the Elecampane that glioblastomas were positively affected, lung cancer, colon cancer, cervical cancer, liver cancers, and various types of leukemia. So that's from one of the compounds in this plant. And then isoalanolactone is very similar, has a slightly different chemical composition, but also has significant effects, and they're in the same plant. So isolantolactone induces apoptosis. So apoptosis is the death of cells that should have died but didn't. And that's essentially what goes wrong with cancer, is their termination signal has not been activated. And so they continue growing and proliferating and create additional demands on the body that they shouldn't, either through pressure or increased presence, as well as creating their own compounds that affect the body metabolically. So ROS-mediated endoplasmic reticulum stress and inhibition of STAT3 in prostate cancer cells is this particular article here by Chen et al. In the Journal of Experimental and Clinical Cancer Research in 2018. So there are a number of different articles. These are just two that I pulled that looked at those particular compounds specifically in Elecampane. That's the inulin helename plant that we're looking at here this evening. So for harvesting it, the root is the primary component, although it was referenced that the flowers are used too, can be used as well, but they don't have the same potency as the roots. Harvest the roots in the fall after the seed has been produced, or in the spring before the leaves appear. So if you're going to harvest it in the spring before the leaves appear, you're going to need to know where those plants are and stake them so you know where to dig, and you're not just digging randomly. You can see some pictures of the roots down in the lower left, some that are sliced in the central picture. 2 to 3 year old roots are best. That's when their potency is fullest. If you get beyond 3 years, they begin to get woody. You can maintain the central growing stem and maintain its viability through the season. So it's a perennial, it's going to come up each year. But just gather the roots from lateral roots that are going out and extending beyond the main clump, and those would be your 2 to 3 year old roots that are going out beyond. So you can see the general size there, about the size of a good sized carrot would be the size of a 2 to 3 year old root as compared to some of the smaller roots. You might pick and choose and then kind of replant back into the soil. You could probably also divide your plants and increase your quantity if you chose to do so. Oops. So just some things to be cautious about when using Elecampane. It may cause drowsiness, so you don't want to combine it with any sedatives. This probably has a longer warning list than most anything. It's very beneficial, but you just want to pay attention to some things here. Particularly don't use it 2 weeks prior to elective surgeries. It can have some effects that don't go well with the medications or the procedures that may be involved there. Some people, if they're allergic to the aster family, should avoid it. They report skin rashes associated with contact and use of Elecampane. Blood pressure should be monitored carefully while it's being used. So it's not something you'd want to use on a just an ongoing basis from a medicinal standpoint, because it could cause some blood pressure interferences. So just monitor blood pressure carefully. And in the same vein, monitor blood sugar carefully, especially for those who are diabetic and may or may not be taking insulin for that. So the monitoring of blood sugar is important for that because of the inulin's effects on lowering blood sugar. You don't want to have a hypoglycemia state be induced. If you take in too much, so remember we talked about starting slowly with small doses and kind of building up to the optimal dose, diarrhea, nausea, and vomiting could ensue if excess amounts were taken. Also avoid during pregnancy. It can have uterine stimulation effects, which early on in a pregnancy would not be desired at all. You want to make sure that you're going to avoid that. You don't want to have an early preterm delivery. Just heard of a very young preterm delivery baby here just now. It's just really difficult when they should be nourished inside the womb to be pushed out sooner than God designed. So that's looking at Elecampane. If you'd like to revisit this this topic, preparing for the timeoftrouble.com is where this will be archived, and you can feel free to share that and use it for additional resources in your toolbox.